Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be discussing how long this cycle could go. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. Now, on this channel, we've discussed market cycle theory a lot, and we've put out these time estimates on how long the cycle could theoretically go on for. Once upon a time, when we introduced the concept of lengthening cycles back in 2019, it was mostly ignored. But now what you'll see is there's going to be more and more reasons, in my opinion, to think that the cycle will lengthen, okay? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to do the same type of analysis we've done before. I'm going to mention a couple other types of bits of analysis that we've done in the past as well. But the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to measure it three ways, right? We're going to measure the market cycle three different ways because I've seen some confusion in the comments. So we'll just do the same thing again, see where we currently are today, and then what that could look like for the rest of this cycle, okay? So again, is this dubious speculation? It is, okay, it is. Now, we're going to measure it three ways, as I said. The first way is from bottom to top. Okay, so the first cycle lasted about 50 weeks. Okay, so let's note that. The first cycle lasted about 50 weeks. People always have trouble with the way I draw my fives, but the first cycle lasted about 50 weeks. From there, the second cycle lasted approximately 100 weeks. You can see this is about 105 weeks, okay? So we'll say cycle one was 50. Let's actually put it down here so we have a bit more room. That way you guys can see me draw a 5 again. Cycle 1 was 50 weeks approximately. Cycle 2 was about 105 weeks. Okay. Now we're going to go take a look at cycle 3. I'm going to go ahead and delete this up here. And then cycle 3, starting back over here to the top, what do you know? It's about 152 weeks. Okay, so cycle 1 was 50, cycle 2 is 105, and then cycle 3 is 152 weeks. Okay? Now, it's pretty evident from this analysis that every cycle seems to get longer by about 50 weeks or so. This one got longer by about 45 weeks. Okay, so about 45 weeks here. And then this, from here to here, it wasn't, it was about, 47 weeks, right? 47 weeks. So from here to here, it was 47 weeks. Okay, so pretty similar that they increased in length by about the same amount when you measure the market cycle from bottom to top, okay? So then the question becomes, where are we today? How far along are we? Okay, so if we go to the market cycle bottom, and let me actually zoom in because I want to get this correct rather than I want to actually try to get that bottom right there because we went to about 3,100 or so. It's right here. So far this cycle, we're out about 152 weeks. Okay, let's look to see where that is on our prior market cycles. So cycle 4 so far is at 152 weeks. But it feels kind of different, right? I mean, it doesn't feel like we're at a market cycle top. I've argued for years that a lengthened cycle does not mean that this time is different. It doesn't. It means that this time is the same. It's the same thing if the cycle lengthens. What would be different, in my opinion, is if this cycle ended in 4 years. Because the only cycle that lasted 4 years was the last one, okay? So I would argue that it's recency bias to say that this one also has to go 4 years. I think that it's much more likely to go further out, okay? We're also going to talk about, how this analysis could end up being wrong, okay? You should try to poke holes in everything. So currently, we're at about the same number of weeks into this cycle that we ended at during the last market cycle. But I don't think this doesn't really seem like a market cycle top to me. Now, I know the Bitcoin bears, your friendly neighborhood Bitcoin bears would argue this is a double top, okay? And while it is certainly possible we could get rejected in the short term, I do not think that this is the top of the cycle. I do think we will continue higher above $69,000. It's just going to take us some time to get there. Now, if we were to just simply dubiously speculate and just say, well, what if we just add another 45 weeks or so, right? 45 to 47 weeks. Where would it put this cycle top? Okay, if we go out to say, let's go out to say 199 weeks, because that would get us 47 from where we currently are. So 199 weeks would actually put the cycle peak in October. Okay, so if this one, instead of 152, if it's 199, then that would actually be another distance of 47 weeks between this one and this one. So you could look at this and say, well, it seems like you could have a market cycle peak somewhere near the end of 2022 is a possibility. Okay, it is a possibility. Now, I know that's not a popular theory, and I mean, we'll have to see what happens, but this is just one way to look at the data. Okay, we've looked at the data many different ways. This is one way to look at it, is just measuring it from bottom to top. Okay, that would imply that we could still have quite a ways to go. And I don't really see why we shouldn't. I mean, you know, we've spent the last several months, or like 7 months really, you know, we went down 55%. We've now come back up to the prior all-time highs. It's honestly been a pretty boring year for Bitcoin. Now, a lot of altcoins have gone up a lot, but really so far this year, it hasn't been that exciting for Bitcoin. I know we're celebrating every inch, but at the end of the day, I mean, Bitcoin's been between like 30K and 64K or so for most of the year, right? For like 99.5% of the year, we've just been between 30K and 65K or 64K. Okay, we haven't really spent much time outside of that. Now, 2x is a pretty wide range if you're thinking about like the stock market and whatnot. When you think about cryptocurrency, a 2x move in an entire year is pretty normal, right? It's pretty much just normal volatility that you'll see with crypto, even Bitcoin. Bitcoin is, you know, it frequently does that kind of stuff where it moves up 2x in a relatively small period of time. So that's one way to measure it. All right. The other way to measure it is, why don't we go from bottom to bottom? Okay, instead of bottom to top, why don't we go bottom to bottom? And I'll leave those on there. So we'll go from here over here. Okay, and we'll say that this one is about 74 weeks. Okay, now we'll look at this bottom and go to the next one. I might need to fix this a little bit because I want it to line up with what I had before. Okay, I think that's lined up with what I had before. This one was about 162 weeks. Not quite, or actually a little bit more if I go all the way over. And then, so about 166 weeks or so, approximately, maybe plus or minus a week there, because I'm probably not getting it perfect. The next one was approximately 204 weeks. Okay, so when we measure it this way, this is from bottom to peak. Okay, now if we measure it from bottom to bottom, what are we going to see? So we'll see the first one was about 74 weeks. Okay, the second one was about 166 weeks. And then the third one was 204 weeks. Okay, so what you notice is that the cycles as measured from bottom to bottom are also lengthening, right? I mean, clearly, this is almost 100 weeks, not quite, right? You're talking about like 90 weeks or so, about 90 weeks. This one wasn't nearly as much, of course. This was more like 40 weeks. What you'll notice is that it seems like as measured from bottom to bottom, then the market cycle should also theoretically lengthen. So if we were to measure that out again this way, and just say, well, let's assume, where are we today? Well, today, again, we're already at about 152 weeks or so. If we go out 204 weeks, which is what we would have been at last cycle, then it would put the next market cycle bottom by the end of 2022. Okay, that would be if it's the same as last cycle. Now, that clearly doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you're thinking, well, how in the world can the peak be December, let's say Q4 of 2022, while simultaneously saying the bottom is at the same time? Well, again, that's if it's the same length as the third one. What if we just shifted out another 40 weeks or so, maybe even less? You could see the next market cycle bottom coming out in 2023, maybe late 2023. So potentially, the fourth one could be somewhere out 250 weeks plus from bottom to bottom, which again still puts the market cycle peak pretty far off. Okay, or sorry, the market cycle bottom pretty far off. Like you're talking about a long way to go. Okay, now the other way you can measure it, which is probably the most dubious, is to measure it from peak to peak rather than say bottom to top or bottom to bottom. measure it peak to peak. And what we'll notice is that the first one here, and we'll do this one up here, so we'll go say peak to peak. The first one is about 129 weeks, right? The second one, if we measure it from peak to peak, so we'll do that right here, is about 212 weeks, right? Now, how far have we gone already in the third if we measure from peak to peak? Well, assuming, I don't think this is a peak, but assuming it is, that would be about 204 weeks or so. But again, that really does show you how different this cycle would be if it's the only one that doesn't lengthen. Again, it's not different if they lengthen. That's just more of the same. What would be different is if it played out exactly like it did last cycle, because the cycles before that were completely different, right? They were not like the last cycle. The last cycle was a long, drawn-out cycle. The cycle before that one was a double peak cycle, and the cycle before that one was just straight up. So they all have been very different from one another. Okay, so peak to peak, 129 weeks. 212 weeks. Again, if you check my math on this, it could fluctuate by plus or minus a couple of weeks probably, because I'm not zooming in to get exactly the week here, but you get the idea. 204 weeks is where we are today. Do I think that we're at a market cycle peak at 69K? No, I don't. I don't think this is a market cycle peak. I look at this and say, well, why can't we continue to extend out? You know, like what if we were to extend out until, say, let's say we extend until the summer of 2022. That would put us at 234 weeks, right? 234 weeks. If we were to go out until, say, the end of 2022, okay, the end of 2022, then that would put us I'm changing it from the bottom, not the peak there. If we were to go out to, say, the end of 2022 from up here, that would put it at about 260 weeks. Okay, so you can see that it really would match the trend if this cycle extends well into 2022. Okay, so when we talk about market cycle peaks and whatnot, I know a lot of people are assuming that we get a market cycle peak in 2021, and this has been more or less the narrative that most models have been pushing for the last several years. And I'll be honest with you guys, they could be right? Like there's really no telling what can happen in the next 50 days. But my argument is this. Do I think the next market cycle peak is in 2021? I don't. I don't think it's in 2021. I think we have a ways to go. I think, everyone's waiting for this, for this 200K Bitcoin, whatever, by the end of the year. I've seen so many promises, 300K. I've even seen 400K, 500K in the next 50 days. And I look at this and say, look, guys, that's highly likely not going to happen in that short of a time frame. Okay, one way to visualize that a little bit better is what we can do is we can look at what Bitcoin has accomplished this year so far, and let's just draw a line at the very end of the year. This is the last week of December. Okay, this is the last week of December right here. And if you're thinking Bitcoin's going to go to 200K by the end of the year, which is actually a more conservative prediction out of some of the ones I've seen. If you think it's going to go to 200K by the end of the year, you're basically saying that we're just going to go straight up like this, which would look very abnormal, I think, when thinking about like the chart of Bitcoin, for it to just go up straight up like that when we haven't really been seeing that recently. Instead, with Bitcoin, we've actually been seeing more of these rounded tops recently, right? All these rounded moves, where rather than having sort of like a quick move up and then back down like we saw before, we're getting sort of these rounded tops, okay? Which I think is interesting. I think it's interesting. So I would personally assume that a rally to 200K by the end of the year looks highly unlikely. Furthermore, the predictions that have us going up to 300K by the end of the year look even more unlikely, okay? And I look at this chart, and again, I'm not trying to be super critical. I look at this chart and just say, how could anyone believe that we're gonna just shoot up to 300K within about 6 weeks or so, 6 or 7 weeks? It just seems very unlikely to happen. To show you how unlikely it would happen, Look at what we were able to accomplish last year, okay? If we were to take that move and then just where we went straight up, if we assumed that we could do that exact move today, which is highly unlikely again because the market capitalization is much higher. Back when we started this move, Bitcoin was only at like $10,000. Now we're already at like 64K. If we made that identical move again, we still wouldn't hit 300K by the end of the year. We wouldn't even hit 200K by the end of the year. We could get over 100K by the end of the year if we were to emulate that move. But you really can see that if you just sort of take a step back and look at what has happened this cycle, and you hear all these price predictions of what has to happen in the next 5 weeks and the promises that Bitcoin's going to the moon, I would just say, look, be conservative with your predictions, be pleasantly surprised if you're wrong, okay? So what does that mean for me? Well, for me, I would say, until proven otherwise, I'm going to assume that the cycle will lengthen. This is something we've said since 2019. Back in 2019, I even said, guys, look, fast forward a couple years, all these models that have been pretty rigid on 2021 end of year predictions, they're probably going to become a lot more flexible all of a sudden when we don't necessarily hit their 300K by the end of 2021 projections. Now we're getting close to that, and of course, all these different models have all of a sudden developed more flexibility than I've ever seen possible before. Okay, so the point is to say is there's a lot of ways you can look at the market cycle. And a lot of people are making lofty promises of several $100,000 Bitcoin within the next 6 weeks. Is it possible that they're right? Of course, there's always a possibility that any of these price predictions are right. But if you're trying to take it to the bank, I don't think they're going to cash it in. Okay, so where could we be wrong about lengthening cycles? What would cause us to say, well, maybe lengthening cycles aren't true and maybe this time is different and that it ends before the end of the year, right? Well, the way that I could see that potentially happening is if Bitcoin were to go parabolic from here until the end of the year. And if that were to happen, if I'm just giving you an idea, if Bitcoin were to say rally like this, I mean, even when I try to draw the rally really steep, it still goes into 2022, right? But if we just started to rally up like this, okay, where it's hard to even draw it without really getting close to the end of the year. But if we were to rally up, let's say to 150, 200K, somewhere in that area within the next 6 weeks, it could theoretically be a market cycle peak, and then we would have to say, well, maybe lengthening cycles aren't true. But we've been drawing the same stuff on the charts since 2019. So 2019, 2020, and 2021. And here we are. We got less than 50 days left in 2021. And while I believe a lot of people were hoping that 2021 would have hit 300K 3 months ago, unfortunately, that's just not what has happened in 2021. Okay? 2020, the end of 2020 was actually a fairly nice rally. Okay, that's what we're waiting for. These sort of bunny hills are fun, okay, but this is not what I would consider a market cycle peak. So, what are some ways this could look? Like, how could this ultimately play out? Well, let's draw some lines on the chart, which we know we like to do. Let's assume so we know the next halving is when in like early 2024. So let's say the next halving, and again, it's hard to get an exact date because again, it varies depending on the blocks, but let's just say the halving sometime in early 2024. We know the first halving was in late 2012 or 2012. We know the second halving was in July of 2016. We know the third halving was in May of 2020. So, there stands to reason the next one's probably going to be in early 2024 at this rate. So let's say that's the next halving, okay? If that's the next halving, and the next peak is, let's suppose, let's draw a rectangle. Because again, saying a certain month is really hard to do because you have to say, we'll see when we get there, right? We'll see when we get there. Let's say the next peak is sometime out starting in May, all the way out till, say, the end of 2022 or something. Maybe even early 2023. So, I don't think it's going to be that late in 2023 if it were to go that long. But let's say this is in 2022. So let's go all the way back to 2022. So let's say the next market cycle peak is somewhere, let's just say in this window, okay, in that window. Now it is a pretty big window, I'll grant you that, but the point is to say, look, it doesn't really matter. Like once we get there, we can see what the market conditions look like and then try to identify if it's near a market cycle peak or not. Okay, so this is the next halving. This is potentially where I could foresee another market cycle peak for Bitcoin. What would that look like potentially? Well, it is still possible that we break out in Q4. Okay, I mean Bitcoin does tend to be bullish. So one possibility would be, say, like a breakout here. Maybe we come back to retest or something, and then we continue on. We move up something like this, and then we have a market cycle peak. We come back down, maybe not that low, and then we just continue on like that. Okay, that could be one potential path that Bitcoin could take. All right. Now another potential path would be a later peak, and let's say it went all the way to the end of 2022. Well, maybe that would look something like this, where people assume that it's a double top in the short term, but then we continue to rally. Maybe we have a triple peak cycle, right? Maybe we do something like that, and then we come back up later on, and then we come back down for a market cycle bottom or something, and then we continue on. Now, market cycle bottoms tend to come before the halving, so I'm probably not drawing this that well. We also have to assume that eventually the halvings will probably not have as much significance as they have had in the past, right? I mean, they just simply won't. It's not like we can expect Bitcoin to just rally on the, exactly when every halving starts for the next 100 years. I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense. But I just want to give you guys an idea of what I could potentially see. So what if we're wrong, right? What if lengthening cycles doesn't pan out? What would cause it to not pan out? Well, again, if Bitcoin were to do something like this, where it were to go straight up, and then we're looking at like a 200K Bitcoin in the next 6 weeks or something, then yeah, I would say we're going to come back down. Okay, and then we're probably going to have to consolidate for a while around these levels, and then we'll sort of gear up for another run later on that it can hopefully get us somewhere up here, and then we're looking at something like that. Okay. So I think you guys get the idea. I've tried to do a good job. I've tried to show you why I think the way I do. Now, remember, there's two other ways we've looked at this before. If you look at the Bitcoin Beauty of Mathematics series that we do, and we take some dubious time ratios, that would put the next peak in the summer of 2022. If you measure out the time from peak 1, if you look at peak 1, peak 2, and peak 3, and then you sort of do like an Arrhenius plot of it, 1 over time, and then extrapolate that out, that would put the next peak in the summer of 2023. So I think the point for me is that like everyone's assuming that the market cycle has to end either this month or next month, or some people assumed it had to end in September, some people assumed it ended in April. I'm just here to say, what if all that's wrong, and what if we're just on the same trend that Bitcoin has always been on, in that every cycle has lengthened, whether you measure it from the halving or whether you measure it from the market cycle bottom. And I'll measure it, I'll show you guys here again on the daily what it looks like. If you overlay them, this is what it looks like. So we look at this and I just say, why is everyone assuming that it has to do something like this in the next 6 weeks? Why can't it do something, maybe it even breaks out here, why can't it do something like this? And then come back down. I'm thinking something like that is more likely, right? Where it doesn't peak right here, but we continue on for a while, and then later on, we then have a market cycle peak, and then we come down, and then perhaps the next cycle will look something like this, where it puts even in lower returns. And normalized, maybe it'll get us to $500,000 per Bitcoin or something. But I think to get a better idea of how that will go, we need to see how high up we go this cycle and then how far back down we go. If we go to higher values, it's more likely we could exceed $500,000. If Bitcoin stops at like 120K, then maybe we need to give a range closer to 300 to 500K for the following market cycle. But hopefully this video has been informative. If you guys like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, And also check out the Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. We also have the premium list at intothecryptoverse.com if you want to know how I'm navigating these markets. Thank you for tuning in. Subscribe, click the bell icon to turn on your notifications, and I will see you next time. Bye.